Buckingham Palace has said King Charles spent a short period of time in hospital today.
Behind the grandeur of Windsor Castle lies a secret that shakes the monarchy to its core. Hidden in a drawer sealed with the royal crest was a letter written by Queen Elizabeth herself, one that was never meant for public eyes. Addressed to King Charles, its words carried the weight of a lifetime of judgment, suspicion, and truth about Camilla. When Charles finally opened it, the revelation was so devastating it left him collapsing in shock. Tonight we uncover the hidden note that exposes what the late Queen truly thought of Camilla and why its contents could rewrite royal history. The hidden letter in Windsor. The discovery of Queen Elizabeth's secret note was not the result of a grand investigation or an intentional search. It was uncovered almost by accident during what should have been a routine cataloging of archival papers at Windsor Castle. After her passing, teams of aides and archivists carefully sifted through drawers, cabinets, and sealed boxes, sorting the immense collection of letters, diaries, and personal notes that the late monarch had accumulated over her 70 years on the throne. It was a task undertaken with reverence, for within these papers lay the personal reflections of a queen whose public composure had always hidden her private thoughts. Deep in one of the lesser-used rooms of the castle, an aide noticed a desk that had not been opened in years. The drawer was stiff with age, reluctant to move, but with enough effort it slid open. At first glance, the contents seemed unremarkable: old ink bottles, faded correspondence, fragments of notes written to trusted staff. Yet tucked in the corner, folded neatly and sealed with wax pressed by the Queen's own crest, was a single envelope. Its weight felt different, heavier with significance, and the name written on its surface was unmistakable: Charles. The room fell silent as the aides exchanged uneasy glances. Such letters were rare, for Elizabeth was not a woman who often recorded her private judgments in writing. Her words were her power, and she guarded them carefully, choosing silence when the world demanded explanation. To find a letter addressed directly to her son, hidden away rather than handed to him during her lifetime, was extraordinary. It suggested that whatever was written within was too dangerous, too delicate, or too painful to share while she still lived. The letter was set aside carefully, its seal intact, and placed into a secured folder to be passed directly to Charles. But even before it left the room, speculation rippled among those who had seen it. Why had the Queen chosen to write this message privately? Why leave it hidden among ordinary papers, sealed and tucked away, as though waiting for the right moment to reveal itself? The possibilities were unsettling, for everyone in the royal household knew that Elizabeth's feelings about Camilla had always been complicated. For Charles, the discovery came at a moment when the weight of the crown already pressed heavily upon him. Grief for his mother was still raw, and the transition from heir to monarch had thrust him into a role that demanded both strength and perfection. To receive a sealed note from Elizabeth written in her hand was both a gift and a burden. He would finally know her unspoken thoughts, words she had chosen not to share face to face. Yet what if those words carried judgment rather than comfort? The letter traveled through guarded hands until at last it reached him. Charles held it in silence, staring at the crest that marked its seal. The world outside Windsor carried on with ceremony and duty, but within the walls of the castle, time seemed to stop. A son stood with his mother's final words in his hands, unaware that what he was about to read would change not only his perception of Camilla, but the very foundation of his reign. Elizabeth's final words. The envelope lay heavy in Charles's hand, its weight far greater than the paper inside. For a long time he hesitated, staring at the seal as though breaking it would unleash something he could never contain again. His mother's handwriting, precise and unmistakable, seemed to reach out from beyond the grave. He thought of how she had always chosen her words carefully, how her silences were often as telling as her speeches. To know she had taken the time to write a personal letter to him and then concealed it among her private things filled him with both hope and dread. He finally broke the wax seal and unfolded the pages. At first, the words read like a mother's reflection. Elizabeth had written of duty, of the burden of the crown, and of the loneliness that often accompanied it. She reminded him of the responsibility he carried not just to the throne, but to the people who looked to the monarchy for stability. Her tone was firm yet affectionate, acknowledging the struggles he had endured as heir and urging him to remain steady in the storm of public expectation. It was the kind of encouragement he had longed for in his youth, delivered too late but no less meaningful. Yet as his eyes moved further down the page, the tone shifted. Elizabeth's words became more personal, her sentences slower, more deliberate. She wrote of the future of the monarchy and the importance of preserving its image in the face of changing times. And then, without warning, her focus turned to Camilla. Charles's breath caught as he realized this was no ordinary letter. These were not just reflections on duty, but private thoughts on the woman he had fought so hard to bring into the royal fold. Elizabeth's words were cautious, but the message was unmistakable. She wrote that she had accepted Camilla's place beside him for the sake of peace, but acceptance did not mean approval. She admitted that her heart had struggled with the decision, that the shadow of Diana could never truly be erased, and that the people would always remember the pain Camilla's presence had caused. The Queen spoke not with cruelty but with honesty, acknowledging her doubts about whether Camilla could ever be embraced as the rightful Queen consort. She urged Charles to consider carefully how history would view this union and whether the choice he had made would strengthen or weaken the crown he now wore. By the time he reached the final lines, Charles's hands trembled. Elizabeth had written that her love for him as a son was unshakable, but as sovereign she could not ignore the truth as she saw it. Her note ended with a simple yet devastating line. "Remember, Charles, the crown endures beyond us all. Guard it not only with love but with wisdom." The words struck him like a physical blow. He set the letter down, his vision blurred with tears. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, not the gentle comfort he had long hoped for, but a final judgment delivered with the weight of a monarch who had spent her life safeguarding the throne. In that moment, Charles realized the letter was not only his mother's farewell, but her unspoken verdict on the woman he had chosen to stand at his side. Charles's lifelong struggle for acceptance. The sting of his mother's words lingered in Charles's mind long after he folded the letter and set it aside. Elizabeth's judgment of Camilla was painful enough, but what cut deeper was the reminder of something he had spent his entire life chasing and never fully receiving: her approval. From childhood, Charles had been shaped by the knowledge that he was the heir to the throne, the boy who would one day be king. Yet he had also been haunted by the reality that nothing he did ever seemed to satisfy the standards set before him. The Queen's letter was simply the final echo of a struggle that had defined him from the very beginning. As a child, Charles was sensitive and quiet, more inclined toward books, art, and reflection than the rigid expectations of his role. He longed for warmth and reassurance, but instead he was met with formality and distance. His father, Prince Philip, valued toughness and strength, qualities he sought to instill in his son with little patience for hesitation or gentleness. Elizabeth, though loving in her own reserved way, placed duty above emotion. Charles often felt as though he was being raised by the crown itself, rather than by parents who understood the boy behind the title. This yearning for acceptance, for even the smallest signs of approval, would follow him into adulthood. When he married Diana, he believed he was doing what was expected of him. The match had seemed perfect on paper, uniting tradition with beauty and grace. Yet even as he stood at the altar, Charles knew his heart was divided. His affection for Camilla, a woman the crown deemed unsuitable, remained unbroken. The marriage to Diana may have given him children and the adoration of the public, but it never gave him peace. When the union collapsed in bitterness and scandal, Charles found himself not only condemned in the eyes of the people, but silently judged by the woman whose opinion mattered most, the Queen. Elizabeth had always been cautious in her dealings with her son's private life. Rarely did she intervene directly, but her disapproval was clear enough in her silences. For Charles, it was a wound that never healed. Every attempt to prove himself worthy of the crown seemed to be shadowed by her doubts, and every step he took closer to Camilla widened the gap between himself and his mother's approval. The public's perception only deepened the divide. While Diana was mourned as the people's princess, Camilla was cast as the intruder, and Charles found himself standing at the center of a storm he could not control. Now, with Elizabeth's letter in his hands, the struggle returned with cruel clarity. She had admitted her acceptance of Camilla, but her words revealed that approval had never truly been given. It was as though his life's deepest battle, the desire to be validated not just as a monarch but as a son, had ended in quiet defeat. For Charles, the crown felt heavier than ever. His mother's final words had stripped away any illusion that his choices had earned her blessing. Instead, he was left to rule with the knowledge that the one person whose approval he had sought the most had carried doubts about him to her grave. Camilla's shadow over Diana. The words in Elizabeth's letter echoed with more than a mother's judgment. They revealed a truth Charles had always known but never wished to confront directly. Camilla's presence in his life could never escape the shadow of Diana. Even after decades, even after Diana's passing, the memory of her lingered in every conversation, every headline, and every comparison drawn between the two women. Elizabeth's doubts about Camilla were not born in isolation. They were shaped by the reality that Diana's spirit still lived within the hearts of the people, and that no successor, no matter how steadfast, could erase her. Diana's marriage to Charles had once been seen as the crown's triumph, the fairy tale union that would cement the monarchy's relevance in modern times. She was young, radiant, and adored by the public, a perfect counterpoint to the image of a monarchy often accused of being aloof and outdated. Wherever she went, crowds gathered not because she was royal, but because she was Diana. She had a natural warmth that reached beyond ceremony, touching people in ways no speech or procession could. That connection became her power, and it was a power Charles never truly possessed. Camilla, by contrast, had always been tied to scandal. To the public, she was the woman who had intruded on a marriage, the figure whispered about in headlines and late-night conversations, the reminder of betrayal. Though Charles loved her with a loyalty he could not abandon, he understood the world did not share his affection. The contrast between Diana's adored legacy and Camilla's contested presence was a wound that never healed. Elizabeth's note only reinforced what the public had been saying for years. The people had crowned Diana in their hearts, and Camilla would forever stand as the shadow behind that crown. This unshakable comparison shaped every step of Camilla's journey. When she entered official engagements, there was always a murmur of Diana's name behind her. When she donned jewels or gowns for state occasions, photographs of Diana in similar attire resurfaced, rekindling the memory of a princess who had long since passed. Even acts of charity, genuine and earnest, were measured against Diana's legacy of compassion. For every effort Camilla made to establish her own place, Diana's memory grew stronger, as though time itself polished her image into something untouchable. Charles carried this weight more heavily than anyone. He had chosen Camilla despite the consequences, despite the damage to his image, despite the judgment of the press. But Elizabeth's letter showed him the truth he had never wanted to admit. His mother had seen what the world had seen. Camilla could be present, but she could never replace Diana. She could walk beside him, but she would never walk in the people's hearts. As he sat with the letter, Charles realized that his struggle for acceptance had always been tied to this single reality. The woman he loved had never stood alone. She stood always in comparison, always against the memory of the woman who had defined an era. And now, with Elizabeth's words etched into his mind, that shadow loomed larger than ever, threatening to consume not just Camilla's image, but the fragile stability of his reign. The night of revelation. The night was quiet in Clarence's house, the kind of silence that presses against the walls and makes every breath feel heavier. Charles had returned to his study alone, clutching the letter as though it might dissolve in his hands if he let it go. Hours had passed since he first broke the seal, but he could not bring himself to read it in full. The few lines he had skimmed earlier had unsettled him so deeply that he needed to steady himself before facing the entirety of his mother's final words. The fire crackled low, its glow flickering against the shelves of books and portraits that seemed to watch him in judgment. Elizabeth's presence lingered in the room not through the grandeur of portraits but through memory itself. He could hear her voice in the cadence of her written words, sharp but restrained, regal but maternal. It was as if she had anticipated this moment, knowing her son would one day be left to confront what she truly thought of the woman he had chosen. The letter was more than parchment and ink. It was a mirror reflecting not only Elizabeth's doubts, but also Charles's deepest fears. He unfolded it again, his eyes scanning the delicate script with a growing unease that made his heart race. The words struck him with brutal clarity. The Queen wrote of legacy, of image, of the monarchy's unyielding dependence on the people's trust. She spoke candidly about Camilla, acknowledging her loyalty to Charles but warning of the storm her presence always carried. Diana's name was not written often, yet every sentence carried her unspoken shadow. Elizabeth admitted what Charles dreaded most, that no matter how many years passed, the nation would never fully forgive, and in its eyes, Camilla would always remain second to the late Princess of Wales. Charles felt the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders as he read. His mother's words were not cruel, yet they were merciless in their honesty. She had not intended them to wound, but rather to prepare him, to strip away the illusions he had clung to for decades. For years, Charles had convinced himself that public acceptance was slowly building, that Camilla's image was softening, that time was healing wounds. But Elizabeth's letter shattered that fragile belief. If the Queen herself, with all her careful diplomacy and measured restraint, had doubted Camilla's place, then what hope remained for the public to ever see her differently? As the words sank in, Charles's hands trembled. The firelight blurred, his vision swimming with a mixture of grief and realization. He had spent his entire life chasing approval, never feeling truly accepted as heir, as husband, or as king. Now, even in her final words, his mother had confirmed that his greatest choice, the love he had fought so hard to legitimize, would always be seen as a stain upon his reign. The silence grew unbearable. The letter slipped from his hand onto the desk, its edges curling slightly in the heat of the fire. Charles pressed his palms to his eyes, fighting against the rising tide of despair that threatened to overwhelm him. For the first time since his accession, he felt utterly alone, abandoned not just by the public, but now by the one voice he had long sought approval from. And in that moment, with the weight of Elizabeth's judgment echoing in his mind, Charles's body gave way. His knees buckled beneath him, and the room tilted violently as the letter lay open on the desk, its damning words staring back at the empty chair. The night of revelation had come, and with it the breaking of a king, a collapse that shakes the palace. The crash echoed through Clarence's house like a cannon blast. The sound of Charles's body striking the polished floor sent shockwaves of panic down the corridors. For a moment, silence followed, heavy and suffocating as though the very walls held their breath. Then came the hurried footsteps of aides, their voices sharp and anxious as they rushed into the study. The sight that greeted them froze them in their tracks. The king lay motionless, his face pale, his body slumped against the carpet, the fire still crackling as though mocking the chaos that had erupted around him. The letter remained on the desk, spread wide, its words exposed to anyone who dared glance at it. But the aides knew better than to touch what was not theirs. Their focus was on the king, on the terrifying stillness of his chest before the faint rise and fall of shallow breathing reassured them he still clung to life. Calls were made in frantic whispers, the royal physician summoned under strict orders of discretion. Nothing about this incident could be allowed to leak beyond these walls, not yet, not with the monarchy already walking a fragile line in the eyes of the public. As medics arrived under the cover of night, Clarence's house transformed into a stage of hushed urgency. The study doors were closed, guards stationed outside, and every servant sworn to silence. Yet whispers spread like fire in the dark, fueled by fear. Some claimed exhaustion had taken its toll, others whispered of grief that had never healed. But among those who had seen the letter lying on the desk, a far darker suspicion took root. They knew the Queen's handwriting when they saw it, and they wondered what truths could be so crushing as to bring a king to his knees. Charles was lifted gently, his body limp, and laid upon a stretcher. His face was drawn, aged by decades of burdens, yet never before had he appeared so fragile, so broken. The medics exchanged glances, their expressions grim, but they too understood the rules of this house. Silence was survival. Camilla had not yet arrived, and already the tension was unbearable. The question lingered unspoken in every mind. What would happen when she learned what had triggered this collapse? The letter, still perched on the desk, became the center of unspoken dread. One of the aides, unable to resist, caught sight of a line as the paper shifted in the draft of the open door. It was not a condemnation written in anger, but something far worse. A truth stated plainly, a legacy weighed with precision. That fleeting glimpse was enough to confirm their fears. The Queen's words had not been kind. When Camilla finally entered, her eyes darted immediately to the stretcher, her face twisting with shock before hardening into steel. She demanded answers, but none were given. The aides knew they could not speak, and the physician's presence shielded them from having to. The king was carried out quietly, his collapse hidden behind the veil of night, but the secret burned in every witness's mind. The palace had been shaken not by scandal in the press or protest in the streets, but by the ghost of a queen who refused to remain silent even in death. And though Charles still breathed, the weight of her words lingered in the air, heavy and unmovable, a judgment none could erase. Camilla confronts the truth. The corridors of Clarence House seemed colder that night as Camilla's footsteps echoed against the polished stone. Her eyes remained fixed, sharp with suspicion as she replayed the sight of Charles being carried out on the stretcher. She had seen him weary before, even unwell, but never like this. The air in the room had carried an unease she could not ignore. Something had broken him, and she would not rest until she knew what it was. She entered the study, the doors shutting firmly behind her, and there it was on the desk, the cause of the storm, the letter. The handwriting was unmistakable, elegant, precise, every curve and line shaped by the woman whose shadow she had never escaped. Queen Elizabeth's hand. Camilla's breath caught as she reached for the parchment, her fingers trembling though she fought to steal them. She hesitated only for a moment, for she knew that in reading these words, she could uncover the truth or open a wound that might never heal. With a deliberate pull, she brought the letter closer, her eyes scanning the first lines. The words were calm, regal, almost gentle in their cadence, but beneath them lay an undercurrent of judgment that struck like a knife. The Queen had written of duty, of sacrifice, of what it meant to wear the crown not only upon one's head but upon one's soul. She had spoken of Diana not in bitterness but in sorrowful reverence, calling her a figure whose light would never fade, whose memory would always outshine scandal or rumor. And then the truth came, a truth written with the finality of a monarch who had carried her nation through decades of storms. Camilla, the Queen wrote, was never the choice she envisioned for the crown. Though Charles loved her, though time had reshaped public opinion, Elizabeth confessed that her heart never accepted Camilla as the rightful queen consort. It was not cruelty, it was conviction, and it was delivered with the weight of the sovereign's authority even from beyond the grave. Camilla's eyes narrowed, the words searing into her mind. She read them again and again, searching for softness, for any sign of blessing hidden between the lines, but there was none. It was final. It was absolute. The Queen had seen her as necessary for Charles perhaps, but never for the monarchy. For Camilla, it was not just rejection. It was erased. Even in death, Elizabeth's words cast her as an outsider, a shadow against the light of Diana, a woman tolerated but never truly embraced. Her hands tightened around the paper, her knuckles white as rage surged within her. She had endured whispers, endured headlines, endured years of being painted the villain in Diana's tragedy, and just when she believed time had softened those edges, here was the Queen's voice to remind her that acceptance was an illusion. The walls of the palace felt as though they closed in on her, suffocating, pressing her into the corner of history where she was meant to stay unseen. But Camilla was not one to retreat quietly. She set the letter back on the desk, her jaw tight, her mind racing. If this letter was ever made public, it would destroy her place in the monarchy, unravel everything she had built alongside Charles. The collapse she had witnessed was not just physical, it was the beginning of something larger. For the first time, she feared not just whispers, but a legacy that could never be rewritten. She now understood why Charles had fallen. And as she stared at the letter, one thought consumed her. If she was to survive, she would have to fight against a ghost that refused to let go. William demands answers. The morning after Charles's collapse, the palace was buzzing with whispers that moved faster than the official statements could contain. Servants exchanged glances in corridors, aides shuffled papers with unusual urgency, and behind closed doors the silence of unease grew thicker. Yet in the midst of the speculation, one figure moved with purpose. Prince William had returned earlier than expected from a scheduled engagement, his face set in grim determination. He had heard enough to know that something more sinister than exhaustion or stress had brought his father to his knees. William had been raised in the shadow of royal secrets, taught to read the spaces between words, the pauses in conversations, the unfinished sentences that often said more than declarations ever could. When he entered Clarence's house that morning, he carried the weight of his lineage, but also the fierce loyalty of a son who demanded the truth. He was met with staff who avoided his eyes, each one hiding behind protocol, but William's persistence was unrelenting. He made his way toward the study, the very room where Charles had last been seen before collapsing. The moment he entered, the scent of paper and aged leather filled the air. His gaze fell instantly on the desk, where a single sheet of parchment lay, its surface disturbed as if it had been handled too recently. He moved closer, his pulse quickening, and as his eyes skimmed the elegant curves of the handwriting, reality struck him with the force of a blow. The words belonged to his grandmother, the Queen, and they were words that revealed a truth he had long suspected but never confirmed. William read with growing intensity, his expression hardening with each line. The Queen's doubts about Camilla, her refusal to see her as a rightful queen consort, and her enduring reverence for Diana, all laid bare in quiet but resolute prose. His mother's name appeared not as an afterthought, but as the unshakable presence she had always been. William closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the tug of grief that never fully left him, the memory of his mother's smile rising in stark contrast to the coldness of palace walls. When he opened them again, Camilla was standing in the doorway. Her face betrayed no guilt, only defiance, as though daring him to confront her. For a long moment, neither spoke, the silence carrying a tension that could split stone. Then William's voice cut through the air, low but firm, demanding to know why this letter had been hidden, why his father had been allowed to suffer the burden of its words in secret. Camilla tried to compose herself, but William's presence left little room for evasion. He reminded her that his grandmother's words carried not just private sentiment, but the authority of a monarch whose reign had shaped the nation. He demanded to know if Camilla had tried to conceal the letter, if she feared the truth because it undermined her place beside his father. Each question he asked was sharper than the last, and though Camilla held her ground, her silence spoke louder than any denial. William left the study with the letter in his hand, his mind already fixed on what needed to be done. He could not allow his father to carry this weight alone, nor could he permit Camilla to twist the truth into something convenient. The legacy of his grandmother, the memory of his mother, and the future of the crown all converged in his grasp. As he walked down the hall, determination etched into every step, one thing became clear. The time for secrets was over. The truth would not remain in the shadows, not while he still had a voice. The collapse of silence. William's footsteps echoed through the corridors as he clutched the letter, its weight far heavier than the parchment it was written on. The words of his grandmother burned into his mind, not only as a son, but as the heir to the throne. The time for quiet tolerance had ended. His father's collapse had made that clear. The monarchy could no longer survive on secrets whispered behind gilded doors. The truth had to be confronted, no matter how painful. When William entered the private chambers, Charles sat in an armchair, his complexion pale, his eyes shadowed by the weight of exhaustion. Yet even in his fragility, he looked up at his son with a mix of fear and anticipation. William placed the letter on the table between them, the silence of the room amplifying the significance of the gesture. Charles's eyes flickered toward it, and his hands trembled slightly. William spoke with calm resolve, explaining that he knew everything. The Queen's doubts, her unease with Camilla, her enduring devotion to Diana. He told his father that silence could no longer protect them. Charles's voice cracked as he admitted that he had tried to shield his sons from the cruelty of palace politics. He confessed that he had hidden the note out of fear that the monarchy would fracture under its truth, fear that William and Harry would be pulled back into a cycle of grief they had never escaped. William listened, but did not relent. He reminded his father that strength was not found in silence but in honesty, that the people who still adored Diana would not accept shadows and half-truths. Camilla entered midway, her presence sharp against the fragile air. Her expression was one of indignation, but William's gaze silenced her before she could speak. He declared firmly that the monarchy's survival depended on openness, that his grandmother's voice could not be buried any more than his mother's memory could be erased. Camilla faltered, the defiance draining from her face as Charles closed his eyes, the truth pressing down on him like a crown too heavy to bear. In that moment, the silence of Windsor shattered. The note was no longer a hidden relic, but a reckoning. The walls that had kept secrets for generations trembled under the weight of truth, and the monarchy stood at the edge of collapse or rebirth. The choice was no longer theirs to delay. It had to be made, and it had to be made now. As the dust settles on Windsor's darkest secret, one truth becomes undeniable. The monarchy's future will forever be haunted by the past. Queen Elizabeth's final words were not just a private confession, but a mirror held up to the crown itself, exposing its fractures, its regrets, and its burdens. For Charles, the letter was both a collapse and a call to courage. For William, it was a reminder that the legacy of Diana and the whispers of Elizabeth would shape his reign. And for Camilla, it was proof that shadows can never truly be hidden from history's unrelenting light. What do you think about this story? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more videos like this. Thanks for watching.